This channel is part of the History Hit network.
On a dark, moonless night in the year of our Lord, 1314, Thomas Randolph, the young Earl of Moray, gathered a small band of warriors round him. They were about to embark on a daring attempt to scale the sheer rock face of Edinburgh Castle and take the garrison by surprise. The second last castle, still in English hands in the whole of Scotland, was about to fall into the hands of the Scots. The long war of Scottish independence was approaching its immortal climax. It was a bleak and stormy day in March 1286, when Alexander III, King of Scots, presided over what was to be the last meeting of his council. They met high above Edinburgh, in the Castle of the Maidens. Little of importance was discussed, and afterwards, ignoring the foul weather and the advice of his companions, he insisted on rejoining his queen at Kingaorn, on the other side of the Forth. Alexander crossed the river safely by the Queen's Ferry. But in the rain and in the darkness, he somehow became separated from his guides. Next morning, he was found on the beach with his neck broken. The stage was now set for a bitter struggle, which was to culminate some 28 years later on the marshy banks of a small stream winding its way below Stirling Castle, the Bannock Burn. King Alexander left no sons to succeed him. His only heir was his granddaughter, a young Norwegian princess, and when she died in Orkney 4 years later, Scotland was faced with the bleak prospect of civil war over the complicated rights of succession to the throne. Anxious to avoid this, the guardians appointed to rule the country turned to Edward I, King of England, and asked him to decide which of the various contenders ought to be offered the empty throne. King Edward, who had briefly been Alexander's brother-in-law, was only too happy to oblige, but insisted that in return the Scots should acknowledge him as Scotland's overlord. All of the claimants to the throne were men of Norman French descent, who had married into the old Celtic aristocracy. They also held lands in England, and 3 of them, Balliol, Bruce, and Cumming, had actually fought for Edward's father, King Henry III, at the Battle of Lewes in 1264. As a result, Edward was able to argue quite persuasively that since they were already his subjects anyway, he was entitled to treat Scotland as a province of England rather than an independent state. In the circumstances, the guardians felt that they had little choice but to agree. And over the next 18 months, the original 13 claimants, or competitors, were whittled down to just 2. John Balliol, Lord of Galloway, and Robert Bruce, Lord of Annandale. Balliol won the favour of nobility and became King John of Scotland.
History Hit is like Netflix, just for history fans, with exclusive history documentaries covering some of the most famous people and events in history just for you. With familiar faces such as Dan Jones and Dr. Eleanor Janega, we've got hundreds of documentaries covering the greatest figures and events of medieval history. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Chronicle fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code Chronicle at checkout.
There aren't many sources for Bannockburn, of course. It was a long time ago. But of those which do survive, 2 in particular are quite important. One, the Lanercost Chronicle, written by an Augustinian friar at Lanercost Priory near Carlisle, tells the story very vividly from the English point of view. He himself saw many of the events in the story, and he obviously talked to a number of people, because all the way through he comes out with the phrase, "I heard this from someone who was there." And it's a very vivid account. On the other hand, on the Scots side, probably the most important source is the Bruce, a long poem by another monk. Everybody in those days who could read and write was a monk, called John Barber, who came from Aberdeen. And there's a very long metrical account of the Wars of Independence, dealing with Bruce and also very skillfully weaving in a lot of stories about the Douglas family, who were also rather important at the time. Whether they were quite so important in the War of Independence, we don't know, but certainly it was politically astute of him to work in the Douglases. Some of the stories he tells are very legendary. The Bruce killed quite a number of people in most remarkable fashion, and so did his Peyton Douglas. But again, it does provide a very important story. It's an oral tradition, and a lot of the story, a lot of the detail would be lost without it.
An Augustinian canon at Lanercost Priory recorded the result with some satisfaction.
On the feast of Blessed John the Baptist, it was determined John de Balliol had the better right to the kingdom of Scotland, and that it fell to him by right. When he heard this, my Lord Edward, with the consent of the nobles and of the majority of the deputies, conferred the kingdom of Scotland upon John de Balliol, who did homage for it. In the same year, after Easter, Edward, King of England, called a parliament at Norham in the 19th year of his reign, concerning the affairs of the realm of Scotland, where the suzerainty of Scotland was adjudged to him and conceded unanimously by the nobles of the aforesaid realm, having first touched the sacred Gospels.
At first all went well, and the English overlordship looked as if it would endure. But in 1294, Edward ordered King John to raise an army to fight in English service in France. This peremptory demand was refused, both by Edward's own English vassals and by the Scots. The king was perfectly entitled, they said, to demand men for the defence of the realm, but he had no right to demand them for service overseas. The issue itself was not a matter of sovereignty, but the Scots transformed it into one, when the previously subservient King John of Scotland signed an alliance with France and sent troops to raid the north of England. Edward was of course furious, and his response was vicious. In 17 bloody days during 1296, he stormed and sacked Berwick, defeated the Scots army at Dunbar, and forced a humiliated King John to sue for peace. Edward treated the Scots not as legitimate enemies, but as rebels in arms to be shown no mercy. His barbarous treatment of the defeated Scots kindled the flames of resentment. In the following year, the Scots responded with a national uprising. Sir Andrew Murray raised the north and, moving southwards, linked up with another Scots army led by a fearsome warrior named William Wallace. On the 11th of September 1297, the combined army inflicted a terrible defeat on the English at Stirling Bridge. The Lanercost chronicler recorded his horror at what had happened.
Not daring to openly break their pledged faith to the King of England, some of the Scots caused a certain bloody man, William Wallace, who had formerly been a chief of brigands in Scotland, to revolt against the king and assemble the people in his support. So, about the nativity of the glorious Virgin, they showed themselves in rebellion, and when a great army of England came, they were brought to the bridge of Stirling, where, on the other side of the water, the army of Scotland was posted. Now, the Scots allowed as many of the English to cross the bridge as they could hope to overcome, and then, having blocked the bridge, they slaughtered all those who had crossed, amongst whom perished the Treasurer of England, Hugh de Cressingham, of whose skin William Wallace caused a broad strip to be torn from the head to heel, to therewith make a baldric for his sword. the Earl of Warren escaped with great difficulty and a small following. So hotly did the enemy pursue them.
Unfortunately for the Scots cause, Sir Andrew Murray was fatally wounded in the battle at Stirling. But Wallace still carried the torch and harried the north of England, bringing fire and destruction to the land of his sworn enemy. At the time of the Wallace incursion, Edward was busy campaigning in Gascony, but as soon as he was able, he hastily returned and marched north with a strong army. Edward smashed the Scots army at Falkirk in July 1298. Thereafter, the struggle became a vicious guerrilla war, marked by appalling atrocities on both sides. Wallace himself was finally captured and executed in 1305. But by then, the Scots had found new leaders, most notably Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick, a grandson of the Robert the Bruce who had unsuccessfully offered himself as a candidate for the crown in 1291. Although they shared the same name, grandfather and grandson are seldom confused. The man who was to become Scotland's greatest warrior king is known to history simply as the Bruce. For all that, his loyalties were at first rather uncertain. He had fought in the Scottish cause alongside Murray and Wallace at Stirling Bridge in 1297. But, in keeping with the complicated pattern of shifting allegiance which characterised the medieval era, he changed sides and served under King Edward on the side of the English at the Battle of Falkirk the following year. In fact, Bruce was still fighting for the English when they took Stirling Castle in 1305. But by then, his father was dead and he had inherited his grandfather's claim to the throne of Scotland. Even as he fought for his English overlords, it is likely that he was already plotting to overcome them.
The question of allegiance in the medieval period was extremely pragmatic, just as it is today. It was really a question of grab what, who can. Now, a king, once he was crowned, that was one thing. But for him to be able to retain the crown, that was altogether another, because his tenants-in-chief would never regard him as anything more than primus inter pares, the first amongst equals. So in sum, it was a question of each for himself. In 1302, Bruce got wind of an alliance between John of Balliol and Philip the Fair of France. Now this created the very real possibility of a French military intervention in Scottish affairs. In that case, Bruce became aware all his possessions would be in peril. It therefore very much behoved him to change his allegiance at this point, and he duly did.
At the beginning of 1306, Bruce changed sides for the last time. The vacant throne of Scotland was now his overriding goal. To this end, he murdered John Comyn, his nearest remaining rival for the throne of Scotland. So bitter was the feud between Bruce and his rival that the only place where they both felt they could meet safely was in church. Ostensibly drawn together to discuss a truce, they met near Dumfries in a chapel. Despite this sacred meeting place, Bruce unsheathed his dagger and murdered Comyn in cold blood. Bruce was excommunicated for this act. Nonetheless, he had himself crowned King of Scots at Scone on Palm Sunday. Edward's reaction to these events was predictable. Too ill for campaigning himself, he dispatched an army northwards which caught Bruce unawares outside Perth and scattered his men with a single cavalry charge. Even in the face of this reverse, Bruce was still undaunted, and he took to the hills with a few followers. But a year later, he was sufficiently strong to come back at the head of a small army and defeat the English at the Battle of Loudon Hill near Kilmarnock. In the face of this continued insolence, Edward at last resolved to deal with the Bruce himself. But at 68, he was far too old and worn out. Much against the advice of his household, Edward raised his army and once again marched north. He died at Burgh-on-Sands, 3 miles short of the border with Scotland, and the invasion was abandoned.
Edward I was a really difficult person to follow. Not only was he a very experienced soldier, the Hammer of the Scots, of course, as his nickname was, he was also a great statesman, and important developments took place during his reign in England. He was, above all, though, an experienced soldier. He had dealt with civil war in England, he'd been on a crusade, he'd defeated and conquered the Welsh, he had almost knocked out Scotland in an earlier campaign, and it was only really in his later years as he became older and iller that things began to slip just a bit. But you can criticise him for not really bringing on the first Prince of Wales, of course, as Edward II had been, properly. He did not bring him up properly. And I think part of the responsibility, therefore, for Edward II's weaknesses lie upon the head of his father. Edward II has really received a very bad press, both in his own time and subsequently. And this is not, in fact, entirely fair. Although we must admit he had his favourites, Piers Gaveston and others, and people have questioned his sexual mores, at the same time he was an extremely cultivated king, enjoying art and music and painting. In many ways he was way ahead of his time. But the trouble was he was not really tough enough to be a king in this particular century.
Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, was dead, and the war entered a new phase. By his murder of John Cumming, Bruce had removed a potential rival. But in so doing, he had embroiled himself in desperate blood feud with the rest of the Cummings. Resistance to English rule had begun in the north of Scotland, and it was ironic that Bruce now had to fight against those same northern lords who had fought to establish the country's independence. Bruce defeated the Earl of Buchan at Barra near Aberdeen in December 1307. The harrying of the province of Buchan, which followed this victory, was still remembered with horror 50 years afterwards, but it served its purpose. Slowly but surely, the Bruce tightened his grip on Scotland, and by the summer of 1314, he was no longer a hunted fugitive, but undeniably King of Scots. One by one, the towns and castles of Scotland had fallen, or thrown open their gates to his men. Now only one remained in English hands, and that the most important, Stirling Castle, the key to the kingdom. Although not so large as Edinburgh Castle, Stirling was strategically far more important since it dominated the central plain in the middle of Scotland, where most of the wealth and population concentrated. Today, it is still a majestic and awe-inspiring sight. In the Middle Ages, it was a daunting fortress. For the Scots, the capture of Stirling Castle was vital, but Edward's successor, the new king, Edward II, was equally alive to its importance. Unlike his terrifying father, Edward II was no soldier. Nevertheless, even he recognized that if Stirling Castle fell back into the hands of the Scots, the war was effectively lost. King Edward was determined to relieve the beleaguered English garrison. Following in the footsteps of his father, he too gathered an army about him and marched north in a momentous year, 1314. He was spurred on by the disturbing news that the governor of the castle, Sir Philip Mowbray, had agreed to surrender to the Scots if he was not relieved by Midsummer's Day. Edward's march therefore became both a show of strength and a race against time. Both sides were only too well aware of the importance of the coming encounter. The long, drawn-out struggle was about to be decided one way or another in a final climactic battle. King Edward's army at Bannockburn was raised by various means. At its heart were its household knights, a contingent of armoured cavalrymen permanently employed by him. These professional soldiers were joined by the lesser retinues of various lords, some of whom were mercenaries like themselves, while others were vassals performing the 40 days' service demanded of them by feudal law. In all, Edward mustered something like 3,000 heavy cavalry. Not all of them were knights, of course. Some were ordinary men-at-arms, but by comparison to the Scots, they were very well equipped. Nearly all wore iron helmets and mail coats, supplemented by various types of plate armour. Chainmail will give good protection against sword cuts, but is of little defence against heavy, crushing blows. So while most knights were armed with swords and lances, quite a few preferred battle axes and heavy flanged maces. Accompanying the new king were 20,000 infantrymen. Many of these were raised from the Welsh marches, but the Irish Prince of Connaught was also requested to provide Irish spearmen to serve in the army. The balance of the infantry came in part from the feudal retinues of various noblemen, but most of the foot soldiers were assembled by means of commissions of array. These were summons issued to county sheriffs and to other local leaders, instructing them to levy a certain number of fully equipped foot soldiers from their shires. The task of actually selecting the men who were to go on service was generally delegated by the sheriffs to the village communities themselves. They were simply given a quota of recruits to fill and were then left to produce the required number. All yeomen with lands or rents worth £2 to £5 a year were liable to serve as archers, and naturally the quality of the fighting men varied enormously. Landless labourers were not liable for military service, but they could be hired as substitutes to go in place of yeomen who were chosen to go but wished to stay at home. The local communities were also responsible for arming and clothing the men chosen to go, and it seems to have been customary this time for them to have been given white woolen coats, as well as knives, swords, and bows or spears. Once they had been mustered for service, the foot soldiers were organised into units of 20 men, led by an officer called vintenard, from the French word meaning 20. 5 of these units, or vingtaines, were grouped together in a company, led by a centenar. He rode on horseback, wearing full armour, and was often a professional soldier, though like the vintenard, he might sometimes be elected by his men. There was no formal organisation above the level of the company, although men from the same country or from a particular nobleman's estates did tend to serve together. Come the day of the battle, it was customary to organise the various companies into 3 great divisions, or battles: the vanward, the mainward, and the rearward. It was the job of the marshal, the medieval equivalent of a chief of staff, to allocate the different companies to each division in such a way as to ensure that all 3 had an even proportion of archers and spearmen. The infantry were, of course, much less heavily armed and equipped than the cavalry. Over their basic clothing of shirt, hose, and doublet, foot soldiers commonly wore padded quilted jackets of canvas or leather, and perhaps some mail as well, together with simple iron helmets. If they belonged to a lord's retinue or were in direct pay of the king, they would also wear livery coats, displaying their master's badge, but otherwise plain white coats. Often the red cross of St. George was added to the coats of the infantry. Most of King Edward's infantry at Bannockburn were archers, but there were also spearmen amongst the county levies, and other spearmen and crossbowmen were raised in Wales and in Ireland. The Scots army was raised in a somewhat similar fashion, but in a crucial respect it was very different from the English one. The most important element of the Scots army was not the mounted knights, but the infantry. They were chiefly armed with long pikes. In Scotland, only men of property were seriously considered for the army. It was felt that only those who had possessed a stake in the land could be entrusted to defend it, and in any case a certain amount of wealth was required in order to be able to afford the necessary equipment. Although the Scots infantry were mainly conscripts, they were not the tattered peasant levies of popular imagination. Once the men had been selected and their equipment inspected at Wappenshaws, or weapon showings, they were formed into companies which might be led by local lairds, or in the case of the men from the boroughs, by the bailies or even by the provost himself. Unlike the English foot soldiers who fought principally using the bill and bow, the Scots relied upon large bodies of pikemen, who were grouped together to form skiltrons, a Scots term which quite literally means moving thickets. Each of these moving hedgehogs of pikes was about 3,000 strong. The men were densely packed shoulder to shoulder, forming a forest of spear points, which posed a formidable obstacle to charging cavalry. It did, however, make them very vulnerable to archery, the one arm in which England led the world. As the Scots had found to their cost at Dunbar, and were to do again at Neville's Cross, the English longbowmen were deadly foes if the opportunity presented itself. If the Scots spearmen were left unprotected, the devastating arrow showers from the fearsome English longbows fell upon tightly packed spearmen where they could hardly fail to find a target, bringing death before the Scots even had a chance to come to grips with the enemy. Despite this glaring tactical weakness, the Scots nobles shared the dangers with the men. While the English leaders rode with the cavalry, the Scots knights dismounted and fought in the front ranks of the schiltrons, shoulder to shoulder with their men. Many of the Scots officers were as well armoured as their English counterparts, but since they were serving on foot rather than on horseback, some of them relied on padded jackets and simple iron helmets like their men. Weapon shows were held not only to check that each man possessed the weapons and equipment required of him by law, but also to provide an opportunity for training, which meant that the Scots infantry of the period was much better disciplined and drilled than many of their contemporaries. Throughout the period, however, the Scots were inferior in archers, and they were therefore always vulnerable to the mighty longbow.
The Skilton was an old and well-tested method of fighting the Scots. What was different about Bannockburn was that, unlike many battles in which the Scots were involved, they had time to practice. Any fool can learn what to do with a pike in a very short time, but it takes a long time and a great deal of practice to be able to move properly, move swiftly and move efficiently in a large body. Very often the Scots armies couldn't manage that, the sheer distance they had to travel to actually meet anybody. At Bannockburn, on the other hand, they had a long time to wait for the English to come. They knew the English were coming to Stirling, so they had time while they waited to actually practice moving in large bodies. In fact, it's not impossible that they actually rehearsed part of the battle on the carse below Stirling Castle, so that on the day of the battle they were not only used to moving in large formation, but they were actually used to moving over the very ground in which the battle was fought.
A medieval knight was of course trained from boyhood to use his personal weapons, and the fearsome charge of a body of mounted knights was the greatest shock tactic of the age. But little effort or thought was given to training large bodies of cavalry to fight together. Time and time again at Bannockburn, individual English knights were to charge bravely against the disciplined ranks of Scots pikemen, only to find that their courage and individual battle skills were not enough.
There's nothing very new about the idea of the schiltron as such. Indeed, the very year after the Battle of Bannockburn, speaking of the year 1315, at Mortgarten, the Swiss produced a very much larger form of the schiltron, using in fact 21-foot pikes, whereas those we know of Robert the Bruce were about 14 feet in length. And even then it was not a new invention, of course. Right back in classical history, the city-states of Greece, when they were first emerging, used the phalanx, which was, to all intents and purposes, exactly the same as the schiltron of later times.
King Edward ordered his army to assemble at Berwick on the 10th of June 1314. And travelling north by way of Edinburgh, he reached Falkirk in the evening of the 22nd, barely 10 miles from Stirling. The King of Scots was waiting for him. Unlike William Wallace 17 years before, Bruce had chosen his battlefield with some considerable care. Stirling was surrounded by a low flood plain or carse, a wet marshy area unsuitable for cavalrymen. The old Roman road, however, followed a spine of slightly higher dry ground. A couple of miles south of Stirling, the road crossed a narrow stream called the Bannockburn, and then ran over a low plateau with patches of woodland. This area had been reserved by the Scottish kings as a hunting ground and was called the New Park. King Edward would obviously seek to advance on Stirling along the Roman road. He had a huge baggage train, and it could not be dragged across open country. Therefore, Bruce had first deployed his army among the trees of the New Park just north of the ford over the Bannockburn. Pots or pitfalls were dug across the front of this position, so that if they tried to force their way up the road, the English cavalry would not have one, but two difficult obstacles to cross before coming into contact with the Scots infantry. On the other hand, the flat carse to the east of the New Park was left invitingly empty. On Sunday the 23rd, the English army cautiously felt its way forward to the Bannockburn and halted about half a mile to the south of it. At this point, Sir Philip Mowbray, the governor of Stirling, is said to have slipped out and advised King Edward that as far as he was concerned, the castle had now been relieved, and that there was no need for the king to advance any further. Not surprisingly, even King Edward was a little bemused by this extraordinary suggestion, but at least Mowbray confirmed to him that large bodies of Scots infantry had been seen moving amongst the trees of the New Park. Bruce had in fact taken up a position of all-round defence in the park. Edward was advancing along the road from the south and would soon discover the elaborate and perhaps rather obvious obstacles placed in his path, but there was still a faint possibility that an English frontal assault might be arranged to coincide with a sortie from the castle, or even that the king would make use of considerable superiority in numbers to both attack up the road and swing round into the Carse at the same time. Bruce was ready to fight in any eventuality. Sensibly, however, King Edward began by sending 2 squadrons of cavalry forward to have a look at the new park before committing himself. The first English reconnaissance party, led by Sir Humphrey de Bohun, the impetuous nephew of the Earl of Hereford, advanced straight up the road, splashed across the ford over the Bannockburn, and took note of the defences. Then, to their mutual surprise, they came face to face with a Bruce in person. The King of Scots had ridden out to reconnoitre the terrain. He was quite alone. Young de Bohun acted at once. Couching his lance, he rode straight at the Bruce. Had the Scots king been properly equipped and mounted, he would undoubtedly have responded by accepting the nobleman's challenge and riding at de Bohun in similar style, as if they were in a tournament. Instead, he waited quietly until the English knight was almost upon him, chinked aside on his nimble pony, and killed the unfortunate de Bohun with a single shattering blow from his battle-axe as he thundered past. At this point, some Scots cavalry appeared on the scene and chased off de Bohun's startled followers. But the Bruce's only comment was to complain about the perfectly good battle-axe he had broken in the act of dispatching de Bohun. This stirring incident was captured by the 14th century poet John Barber in his epic poem, The Bruce.
Then sprang they into line, but Sir Henry missed the noble king, and he that in his stirrups stood, wi' an axe that was baith hard and good, with 6 great men stuck amae, daunted neither hat nor helm micht stint. The heavy blow that him he gave, that he the heat the harness cleft, the hand axe shaft broke in twa, and he down to the earth did fa.
Meanwhile, the second English reconnaissance party, led by Sir Robert de Clifford and Sir Henry de Beaumont, had run into real trouble. Crossing the Bannockburn further to the east, they kept to the open ground and were working their way around to what appeared to be the open flank of the Scots position, when a skiltron of pikemen suddenly rolled out of the woods towards them. As his pikemen came clear of the trees, their leader, the Earl of Moray, halted for a moment in order to give them time to close up their ranks again. At this point, a furious argument broke out between the leaders of the English cavalry. A Yorkshire knight, Sir Thomas Grey, was in favour of charging the Scots at once, while they were still in some disorder, but de Beaumont and some others wanted to wait, confidently insisting that the more men who were allowed to come out of the trees, the more of them would be slain. None of them had any doubts at all that they could overcome a rabble of unarmoured pikemen. Stung by de Beaumont's sneering accusation of cowardice, Grey rushed straight at the Scots and was killed at once by the pikemen. Other English knights soon followed him, but try as they might, they could not break into the serried mass of pikes pressing towards them. In their frustration, some even flung their lances at the Scots, like javelins, but all to no avail. And as the Scots resumed their advance, the English cavalry fled in disorder, some to Stirling, others back to King Edward's camp. Having made their point in no uncertain terms, Murray's pikemen calmly marched back into the shade of the trees. The first round of the battle had undoubtedly gone to the Scots. But King Edward now knew that while a frontal assault straight up the Roman road looked like being rather too difficult, it still appeared to be possible to outflank the Scots' position by following Clifford's route. That night, the whole English army ponderously swung round to its right, struggled across the Bannockburn to the east of the new park, and then waited uncomfortably for dawn. Already the operation was going badly wrong. Clifford's reconnaissance force had quite naturally stuck to the relatively high ground near the park. They reported it to be fairly dry, but an army, and more especially an army of over 20,000 men, needs considerably more space than a mere squadron of cavalry, And in order to find that space, the English host drifted further towards the east and blundered into a great bog. Certainly it would be hard to find a worse position for the English army than the one in which they now found themselves. Not only were they standing up to their ankles in mud and water, but they had a large river at their backs and another stream on their flank across their line of retreat, a most unenviable situation. They had, in fact, walked into a carefully prepared trap. A clear night in midsummer is neither very dark nor very long, but the chroniclers all agree that the English army spent a few miserable hours in that evil, deep, wet marsh, crowded closely together, waiting for sufficient light to see where they were and what they could do about it. The Bruce was, of course, aware of this move almost as soon as it had begun, and while the English unhappily floundered about amidst the mud and stagnant ponds, he swung his own army around and formed 3 of the schiltrons into a line ready to face the English at dawn. His brother, Sir Edward Bruce, commanded the schiltron on his right. Then came Murray's schiltron in the centre, and Sir James Douglas's one on the left. The King's own schiltron formed a reserve. An additional reserve in the form of a division of poorly armed and undisciplined Highlanders, the Gillies, was left hidden in the new park. Unlike the English, the Scots had very few cavalry at Bannockburn. Most of the Scottish knights who were present fought on foot in the front rank of the pikemen. Bruce had in fact only 500 light horsemen, led by Sir Robert Keith. These he placed well out on the left flank of the army, where they could guard against any sortie by the garrison of Stirling Castle. The English dispositions, on the other hand, were very badly thought out. Or perhaps it was more likely that the confusion in the bog had upset any plans which might have been made. There were no recognizable divisions of the army, just 2 long lines, one drawn up behind the other. The front line was composed of 9 squadrons of cavalry, each one about 250 strong. And on the left of the line stood a much larger division of some 800 cavalrymen, rather optimistically called the vanguard. Behind this colourful array of chivalry, the English infantry were drawn up in a single disorderly mass, hemmed in between the Bannockburn and the River Forth. The confusion in which the English found themselves at dawn was further increased by an acrimonious dispute which broke out between the Earls of Hereford and Gloucester, over which of them should command the vanguard. The young Gloucester lost the argument. Churlishly he rode up to the king and advised him to delay the battle for a day, until some more suitable ground could be found. Badly chosen though the ground undoubtedly was, the English army was now committed to battle. It was far too late to think of drawing back, and King Edward angrily accused his nephew of cowardice and treachery. To this charge there could only be one answer. Gloucester at once rejoined his men, and without waiting to don his heraldic surcoat or even to make sure that they were following him, he galloped straight towards the nearest schiltron. Like Sir Thomas Grey the day before, he was virtually committing suicide. His horse was instantly speared from under him, and both he and his standard-bearer were cut down. At the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, Sir William Wallace had formed his schiltrons into defensive hedgehogs, not unlike the famous British squares at Waterloo 500 years later. Once he had done that, he simply stood and waited the onslaught of the cavalry. All the while they were at the mercy of the fearsome English longbow. It was almost as if Wallace sensed the stand would be futile. With a fatalistic resignation, his last words to his army were ominous. "I have brought ye to the ring," he said to his men. "Now dance as ye may." The wily old King Edward I had dealt with each schiltron in turn. With calculated ferocity, he first shot great gaps in the densely packed Scottish ranks with his archers, and then he sent in his cavalry to exploit the gaps, where they butchered the survivors. But his son was not the master tactician his father had been, and he was now faced with a far more cunning adversary, the Bruce himself. Bruce's tactics at Bannockburn were very different from those adopted by Wallace. He would not wait to be attacked, but strike first. Before they did so, however, his troops fell to their knees in prayer for safe deliverance in the coming battle.
Now, when the two armies approached very near to each other, the Scots fell to their knees to repeat Pater Noster, commending themselves to God and seeking help from heaven, after which they advanced boldly on the English. They had so arranged their army into 3 columns abreast, so that none of the 3 should advance ahead of the other. The 4th followed behind, in which was the King of Scots. By a truth, when the 2 armies engaged, the great English horses advancing on the pikes of the Scots as in a dense forest, there arose a great and terrible crash of spears broken and destriers wounded to death, and so they remained without movement for a while. The English in the rear could not reach the Scots because the leading division was in the way, nor could they do anything to help themselves. This account I heard from a trustworthy person who was an eyewitness.
Instead of passively standing on the defensive, waiting to be attacked, Bruce formed his schiltrons into columns and began the battle by advancing them down the gentle slope from St Ninian's Kirk and the New Park, down towards the disorderly rabble which was the English army. As battle was joined, the Scots schiltrons advanced against the English cavalry. As they closed together for mutual assistance, it became obvious that they were going to be outflanked on the left, so Bruce led up his own men to prolong the front line. Time and time again, the English cavalry rode boldly forward, vainly flinging themselves against the Scots' pikes. None of them could break through. The Scots stood resolutely, concentrating on killing the horses. As each mailed knight fell or kicked himself clear of his dying horse, he was quickly finished off with swords or axes. John Barbour's epic poem captures something of the atmosphere of this stage of the battle. Bannockburn was no chivalrous encounter conducted between brightly caparisoned knights in a green meadow. It was no elegant tourney fought over the honour of a fair lady, but a muddy, brutal killing match in which no prisoners were taken and fine gentlemen were ruthlessly butchered by common soldiers.
They laid on as men out of wet, for they wi' full stracht might hit, and wi' axes sick blows gaed that they helms and heads clave, and the foes recht hardly met them and dang on doutly. With weapons that were strong as steel, there was a battle-stricken wheel. Sae great dinning were their wise at dunce as weapons upon armour stent. And so spears sae great bristling with sic thran and sic thrusting, sic gurning, groaning, sae great a noise as assailed in another, and cried slogans on every side. Ah, it was hideous for to hear them.
Behind the desperately embattled knights, the English infantry at first stood idly by, unable to intervene in the struggle. From time to time, the archers amongst them tried to provide at least some assistance by shooting over the knights' heads in the hope of dropping their shafts in among the closely packed ranks of Scots pikemen on the other side of the melee. Unfortunately, they also succeeded in shooting many of their own men in the back and were soon ordered to stop. Then some other archers, led by professional soldiers, ran out onto the right of the English line, well clear of the fighting. From this vantage point, they were able to shoot the exposed flank of the Bruce's own schiltron without worrying about hitting their own men. As the casualties amongst the pikemen mounted, Bruce called upon his own cavalry. There were 500 of them, not heavily armoured knights, but light horsemen, capable of moving very swiftly. The English archers had no defensive stakes to protect them, or heavy spearmen to back them up, and Sir Robert Keith's charge was completely successful. The archers were quickly scattered and cut down. The threat to the Scots flank had been averted. In the centre, the battle was going equally badly for the English. Even King Edward had to defend himself with his mace, his hands pulled and tugged at his harness. The battle had been raging for an hour now, and at this point there was an unexpected development. Bruce knew that his men would soon be tiring, but being a good general, he had kept his very last reserve for just this moment. Legend has it that the men who now suddenly appeared on the top of Coxet Hill in the New Park were camp followers. A motley and quite harmless collection of grooms, peasants, cooks and sutlers with makeshift bellows. In reality, they were actually Highland clansmen or gillies. They lacked the training and discipline necessary to make good pikemen, and because they could not stand up to the English cavalry in the open, Bruce had left them hidden amongst the trees of the new park. However, now that the knights were fully occupied in fighting the Scots pikemen, the king called the Highlanders forward. Their intervention was decisive. As the clansmen appeared on the hill above the battlefield, Bruce called out to his men, "Upon them! On them recht hardily!" And the final push began. To their dismay, the English knights saw the Scots reinforcements come flooding forward. And then the dismay turned to horror as they realized that the despised foot soldiers were actually driving them backwards, deeper into the bog.
In the leading division were killed the Earl of Gloucester, Sir John Cummings, Sir Pagan de Tiptoft, Sir Edmund de Morley, and many other nobles, besides foot soldiers, who fell in great numbers. Another calamity which befell the English was that whereas earlier they had crossed a great ditch called Bannockburn into which the tide flows, when they tried to recross it in confusion, many of the nobles fell back with their horses in the crush, while others escaped with great difficulty, and many could not extricate themselves from the ditch. Thus was Bannockburn spoken about for many years in English throats.
Not all of the English knights ran away, or even tried to. Sir Giles d'Argentine, an old crusader, fought his way through to King Edward's side, led him safely from the battlefield, and then, declaring, "I have never been accustomed to run," he returned to the fight and certain death. Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, had won his battle, but the killing was far from over. It is generally true to say that before the invention of gunpowder, few men were actually killed in battle. The vast majority of those who died were cut down while fleeing after the fighting had ended. This was certainly true at Bannockburn. Although many Scots pikemen were killed, mainly by English arrows, only 2 Scottish knights, Sir William de Vipon and Sir Walter Ross, were slain. As for the defeated English, so many of them were killed in trying to flee back across the Bannockburn that it was said to be possible afterwards to walk dry-shod over the corpses. The relentless pursuit went on till nightfall, which at midsummer came very late in the day. King Edward himself made first for Stirling Castle, the nearest and perhaps most obvious refuge. But the governor was already short of provisions, and pointed out to the king that he would soon be forced to surrender. Eventually, a knight was found who was able to guide King Edward round the back of the victorious Scottish army and then eastwards to Dunbar, where he found a ship to carry him back to England. Others were rather less fortunate, as the Lanercost chronicler relates.
As the king and his following fled in one direction, so the Earl of Hereford, the Earl of Angus, Sir John de Seagrave, Sir Anthony de Lucy, and Sir Ingram de Umfreville, with a great crowd of knights, 600 other mounted men, and 1,000 foot, fled in another direction towards Carlisle. The Earl of Pembroke left the army on foot and saved himself with the fugitive Welsh. But the aforesaid earls and others, who had fled towards Carlisle, were captured on the way at Bothwell Castle, for the warden, Sir Walter Gilbertson, a Scot who had held the castle down to that time for the King of England, perceiving that his countrymen had won the battle, allowed the chief men who came thither to enter the castle in the belief that they would find a safe refuge, and when they had entered, he took them prisoners. Many also were taken, wandering around the castle and hither and thither in the country, and many were killed. It was said also that certain knights were captured by women, nor did any of them get back to England save in abject confusion. After this victory, Robert the Bruce was commonly called King of Scotland by all men, because he had acquired Scotland by force of arms.
Chroniclers were inclined to look for the hand of God in such a decisive victory, won against such heavy odds. It was even claimed that the English defeat was by way of divine retribution for the plundering of a monastery on the way north, but the real reasons were purely military ones. In the first place, Bruce chose his ground wisely. While his pikemen were able to operate effectively on the muddy karstland, it was totally unsuitable for the heavy English cavalry. Although he made preparations to fight a defensive battle in the New Park if he had to, he probably intended right from the very beginning to fight the battle in the Carse if he could. Secondly, although his army was greatly outnumbered by the English one, it was much better trained. King Edward's knights were extremely brave, but undisciplined. As a result, their superior numbers were more of a handicap than an advantage. In simple terms, they all got in each other's way. Worse still, there was no effective chain of command on the English side. Not only was Bruce able to control his army, he was also able to judge when best to commit his reserves to the fighting. His own Skiltron had rescued an outflanked left wing. The dangerous threat posed by the English archers was promptly dealt with by a well-timed cavalry charge, and his final reserve, the Highland Gillies, was called forward at precisely the right psychological moment. King Robert and his army won the Battle of Bannockburn because they deserved to.
There's no gainsaying the overall significance of the Battle of Bannockburn. It earned Scotland 3 centuries of freedom from English rule, independence in other words. But militarily speaking, we also learned some very important lessons from this engagement. First of all, there was a danger of overconfidence. English armies had often defeated Scots armies in previous occasions, particularly the Battle of the Standard is a very good example of that, and they were therefore somewhat over-assured of success, and that is always a dangerous thing. Furthermore, many of the young knights who were now in the army for probably the first time in 1314 were inexperienced and certainly indisciplined in the way they conducted their duties, and that was linked to this matter of being overconfident. The English also learnt the vital importance of a good leader. Now, no one can impugn Edward II's bravery. He fought extremely bravely on this particular day. But that was not his role. He was meant to be in control, and that he was not, nor had he deputed control to another big magnate in his behalf. So there are arguments amongst the next commanders about what they were supposed to be doing. So it all broke down on this matter of having a real leader in charge. English losses were pretty horrendous. 22 earls, 68 barons, 1,000 spearmen and archers. And as we know, a further 1,500 became prisoners later, having been tricked into entering a castle. So this was a very severe defeat for the English feudal army. And it was going to be some years before it could pick up its act again and make the whole thing highly effective. But of course, in Edward III, the next king, we were to bring one of our foremost kings of all periods as a soldier, fighter, into the scene, and the days of Edward II would soon be forgotten.
Nevertheless, as the Lanercost chronicler sadly admitted, Bruce had decisively proved his right to the throne of Scotland at Bannockburn. Arguably, King Edward I had in fact been justified in considering the King of Scots to be his feudal vassal, but the long wars of independence established that the ordinary people of Scotland owed no fealty to England's king. This determination was made explicit in the Declaration of Arbroath, drawn up 6 years later in 1320. In it, Bruce's part in the struggle is fulsomely acknowledged. But it goes on to state that should he fail his people, we would instantly strive to expel him as our enemy and the betrayer of his own rights and ours, and we would choose another king to rule over us, who would be equal to the task of defence. It is the shortest paragraph in the Declaration, however, which is the most significant, and which still thunders down the centuries. For so long as 100 men remain alive, we shall never, under any condition, submit to the domination of the English. It is not for glory, or riches, or honours that we fight, but only for liberty, which no good man will consent to lose but with his life.